Much like today, for hundreds of years in the ancient Southwest, ball courts were a symbol of connection within and between towns. Whether Hohokam in design or Sonagua or Mesoamerican in spirit, they were for ceremony, the marketplace, and for some, the joy of the game. They tell a story of 800 to 1450 CE society that we still are appreciating today. Steph Helms is a 20-year naturopathic medical doctor with residencies in therapeutic fasting, energy medicine, and oncology, with a passion for world football, Eastern tropical Pacific oceanography, and Southwest archaeology. He first came upon a Sonagua site in the backcountry of Sedona 25 years ago and still enjoys being out in the field, but in truth has only become absorbed with ancient peoples for the last 2 years.
So a bit of an overview of this talk, all right? We'll be going through a number of different concepts, ideas around ball courts. Mainly we'll be focusing on the Hohokam and their style of ball courts. But we'll also talk about how that extended here in the north, in Verde Valley and up around Flagstaff, beyond the Hohokam's pre-classical period. So after 1100 is I'm calling it. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the Casas Grandes culture that also had ball courts, but their ball courts were later. And to round this all out, we'll also have a bit of discussion about the Mesoamerican ball courts, about Mexico City, about the Yucatan, and that area there, and how that's relational and some similarities, comparison in a way. So some early theories about ball courts here in the Southwest, particularly about the Hohokam ball courts, were that they were water reservoirs, which kind of makes sense. On a certain level, because this is the same ball court we saw before in the artistic depictions, but this is an actual aerial photograph of that Los Muertos ball court. Okay, so you can see that, hey, there's a depression there, trees are growing. You can see that early investigators would think, oh, well, maybe this was a water catchment system of some kind. But there's no canals leading to these ball courts, and there's an entrance and egress, right? So the water would flow through it. It's not a reservoir that would catch anything. Sun temples was another idea. This idea of threshing crops, well, it's a bigger area. There's probably a lot of things that could have been done there. But threshing crops in particular has never been a focus of it. It was just an early theory. Emil, pardon me if I'm mispronouncing any names and such, famous archaeologist who excavated Snaketown, the ball court there, and he's the one that initially made the comparison with ball courts in Mesoamerica. And subsequently, there's been a lot of other associations with the Hohokam cultures here in the Southwest and Mesoamerica. So what was the purpose of the ball courts? And we're really going to get into some more detail later on, but there's always debate in archaeology. No ethnographic accounts of these ball courts, but ceremonial use is really the pivot. There's a ceremonial system that came into play in this pre-classic Hohokam period from 800, let's say, to 1100. So for those 300 years. And some people call this religious revitalization movement that composed a handful of different components. Ball courts, different cooking pits, hornos, plazas, mounds, and the like. And it certainly makes sense that if one group was playing a ball game, that trade and so forth, that the word would travel about it. And of course, you know, anytime you have games, people hang out, people talk, people wager maybe. So the pre-classic, I thought these quotes or these comments here were helpful. The pre-classic Hohokam world was a time of rapid population growth as seen by occupation of permanent villages and in the expansion of canal systems. This pre-classic period is so tied to the regional ball court system that its end is defined by the collapse of the ball court system. And then Abbott, who really has done a lot of work on pottery and how things are connected in, and we'll talk about some of his ideas later. Hey, red and buff pottery, the marine shells, the stone bowls, the pallets are all distinctive of Hohokam. A lot of ball courts. A lot of ball courts. And this doesn't include the 13 or so that are in Flagstaff area. So a lot of the ball courts, unfortunately, we don't know about anymore because they haven't been discovered, or they've been plowed under, or the like. A lot of different numbers have been thrown out and different evaluations of totals. 238, 200, 250. Interestingly, though, at the bottom there, only 22 have actually been excavated, despite what the real number is one way or the other and how people want to count. A lot of times what happens is there's seemingly a discovery, an assessment, and then it has to go, archaeologists have to go out and actually designate that this is valid. And that's part of the reasoning why there's so much variation. It goes on in different numbers. And Molinares had an interesting, in this small sample, 13 of 36 ball court maps. Lack, there's no contour lines, right? Which is really interesting, right? So it's just another facet of ball courts in that, for one, we're not exactly sure how many there are, and a lot of them that we have actually done the surveys on, we have various data as to what the square footage is, how many square meters there are there. Right? And that has to do with berm size and evaluating exactly where the berm is. But with erosion and such over centuries, that can move a little bit, so there's a little bit more interpretation that comes into play. I really like this from Dr. David Wilcox. This is like way back, like 1983 thing. But he makes this distinction between the core area of the Hohokam, right? Right there along the Salt River and the Gila River. And then this idea of there being three peripheral areas. He's calling them intermediate, and the far periphery, primary, secondary, tertiary, just makes more sense to me. But it's interesting to think about how the Hohokam had a unified culture, had unified beliefs on many levels. But also, there was the distinction that there was space. It wasn't all just one big city, because you had miles and miles in between locations. Sometimes there was other factors that came into play. There were other peoples to the east, right? The Mimbres culture was to the east, so that would affect, right? To the north, the ancestral Puebloan folks and how they would affect, right? So, interesting concept to have different Hohokam people, and then their different investment that they might have in their all aspects of the culture compared to the core. So a little timeline here. For myself, I think it's kind of interesting that the pre-classical Hohokam is right at the time where the Toltecs take over from Teotihuacan, right? It's really interesting to me, the timing, because Teotihuacan was really an empire in Mexico that actually had real settlements that came all the way up into the Gulf of Mexico, right? Right into the base where Llamas is, where the river system comes right up to Arizona, right? And interesting to me is perhaps being a component of how the ball courts from Mesoamerica ended up translating. So we had a few hundred years. The Hohokam core held on for a bit longer with having ball courts than perhaps the Tucson Basin. Because of how the village settlement pattern and how the pottery transitioned in the Tucson area, a number of archaeologists are in agreement that Tucson seemed to be abandoning the ball court system earlier. Was it all the way back to 950? A certain degree is a point of debate, but certainly earlier. Dating ball courts always difficult. When was it constructed? When was it utilized? When was it abandoned? Right? These are the same problems we have throughout archaeology. We go through and we try to assess context. What's going on around the ball court or whatever we're looking into? Are there structures built above or below it? The Donny Park ball court up in Flagstaff was a pre-eruption ball court. After the eruption, field houses were built on the berm, so that helps us date it and understand things a bit better. Adjacent structures being proximal. Pit houses being adjacent to the ball court itself also can help us date and help us associatively compile an understanding. There's excavation, the stratification, datable material, the decorated ceramics and such. And I thought it was really interesting that Dr. Wilcox wasn't so keen on the mean ceramic date. To me, as a newcomer, I like that little data point because I can get my head around it, And he makes this point, hey, we need to really look at the whole site, perhaps looking at the latest early date of pottery that we have, the latest early date, and then the earliest late date, right, gives us a range of what the pottery is. And then we can look for context and other aspects of the milieu to really appreciate what's going on with the dates. So the attributes of these ball courts, the Hohokam ball courts, they're all earthen and oval. Openings at each end, slightly sloping floors, plastered floors, so kind of like what we understand about dwellings and the floors being plastered, the walls being plastered inside of dwellings, keep things nice, being tidy, less spiders perhaps. The same thing was done in the ball courts. Always next to an open area or a plaza. In this case, I don't mean a plaza like 1275, sort of late time period plaza that are walled. I'm just talking about an open area, right? And some distinctions there. Pits in the center of the court, and then towards the ends also things embedded. Often there's stone cover. Often there are votives where things are left and put ceremonially, things like shells of obsidian and turquoise, and even this one village of Ironwood but had a human burial underneath the center court. Okay, full on with pots and the whole thing. So helps us appreciate this idea of the game itself might have been the game, but the ball court was really a richly significant, culturally significant, a ceremonially significant place. Post holes, platform structures, sometimes, so generally speaking, two different sizes of courts, large court, small court. Some sites actually have two courts. The small courts, often called Casa Grande style, these ones are more commonly north to south oriented, but recognize that the Hohokam courts are not like the Chaco world or Pueblo Ladino in particular, where so many things are astronomically aligned, cardinal direction aligned. There's no things aren't true north, okay? There's just a lot of variation. In some of my slides I write similar N-S, and I'm kind of saying within 20 degrees, all right? But these smaller ones are the most common ones that we see. And then there's the large ones, like the snake town type. Only 30 of these, more east to west. 5 of them are over 100 meters long, right? So really large. The gentleman here at Snake Town, you can see him standing there. If we're going to think he's maybe approximately 2 meters, then maybe the top of the berm on the edge here, maybe it's 4 meters, maybe it's even approaching 5, right? Off on the left side, you can see how the plastered floor comes up the edge of the embankment. And in the bottom photo, you can get a sense of, well, people can watch from above, and people can do different activities inside. So in the triangle up top here, Snake Town, let's just call it 900 square meters. But as you can see in red, there's some that are really, really large, especially in comparison to American football field, right? Maybe only half of one, but still very big. And then the second Snake Town court is like 200, so big difference in size. And another thing we're going to look at here is comparing Reddington's two sites, where one's half the size of Snake Town, but the smaller one is about comparable. Overall, this is just what a box and whiskers graph. So the orange is central. Let's just call it the core area of Phoenix. And the outliers of the very large courts are those respective dots. But the big picture here is we're looking at the blue courts, which are all the northern courts, Prescott here and Flagstaff area. They're very similar to the central core courts, as well as the southern courts towards Tucson and Green. Here we're back to the Reddington courts. Here we have this large court that we also see over here, and then this little small court, right? So end courts are something that are more typical of large courts, right? But here we kind of have, we'll call it like a medium-sized court almost, that has end courts in it. And the idea of these end courts, perhaps, with a bit of speculation, is perhaps this is where a staging area for ceremonies. Perhaps this is where players would, who knows, be in a penalty box. Maybe this is where players would get ready to go in. Maybe they, who knows. Two areas on the ends. So why different court sizes? Wilcox mentioned, hey, maybe they're playing different games, right? Or maybe it's just the number of players they could play. I really like what Molinarius tossed in, this idea of buy-in of that community. How many people could they corral to dig a hole? Was it just a couple of guys that were really into trying this? Or were they at a ceremony at a village 30 kilometers away? And they really felt deep down that this was really important. They wanted to do this too, and they could do it in their community. So part of the size might have just been how invested were they? How much food did they have? Did it rain? Right? There could have been a lot of components that came into play. So this is a picture that shows the large sites in tan. And this is where I came up with the 30. Right? So the dirt berm around it surrounds the playing alley, stadium seating sort of idea. 500 spectators, imagine that, right? Dr. Wilcox here, again, making a comment that probably most of the berms were closer to 1 meter, right? Not 5 like maybe Snake Town was. Back to this Reddington site that we were looking at a minute ago. We can only see the large court here, right? The smaller court, which is over here, you can't even tell from here. Sometimes being in the air helps, but sometimes it doesn't help you a lot.
Could
So-
you put your beam on the large board? Is it? That's
Okay.
it. And the small one, where did you?
I can't,
Oh, you
you
can't.
can't see it, it's like somewhere right in here.
Thank you.
Sure. So the large one, like 2.7 meters, the smaller one, smaller. But what's interesting is this idea of how many observers, right? How many people standing could watch? How about if people were just lying down, how many could be there, right? And significant numbers could be there. This is a analysis of the same idea here, where here we have people standing versus people lying down. And obviously at the large courts, you could have thousands of people there if everybody was standing. And in comparison, if everyone was lying down, if even in a small court, you could have 100 people. All right? Rock berms. So when the Hohokam made the ball court, they dig out dirt, put it on the edges, and then they hit rocks and put the rocks there. Just build it out. So some areas would be rockier than others. And then conversely, we have this idea of how much erosion would occur in that area, based on the environment, or based on the soil, based on a lot of different ideas. Sometimes what would happen is all that soil would go away, and all that would be left would be the rock mound. Other times, the actual soil would get deposited from the berm, and fields, plazas to the side, and that soil would land in the center of the court, obscuring your ability to even see it was there. So here we're going to talk a little bit about purpose here. Ceremony, as I said, the ritual community building aspects of the ball court. This idea of it being a dance plaza, fertility snake dances, right? Ferdinand in '67 really tried to make a correlation to the Papago dance courts. We really have good archaeological understanding of feasting, right? And a lot of the ball court sites have different roasting pits. Hornos are just bigger roasting pits, where maybe you could have 20 different agaves, right? Circular agaves this big. Where these large hornos here at Snaketown and such could have 200 of them in there. All right, so cooking for a number of people. And this is Los Hornos excavation, and here we have a half excavated one, and here's the ball court itself, and Dr. Wilcox back there in the background for a little perspective. So a couple other things that come into play with ball courts themselves, ceremonial purpose, is if you have a lot of people there, then they're going to trade. They're going to communicate, they're going to talk, build relationship, but also, perhaps, I wanted to say trade again, avail themselves of commodities. But of course we focus a lot on the game. And I think it's important to recognize that we don't really know a lot about the game. Right now, in Mexico, there's still a hip game where all you can do is hit a rubber ball with your hip. You can't use your hands or anything like that, right? So we have a sense of that ethnographically. There's also a common game now that's a field hockey-like game that's played out in the open terrain. But we certainly have a sense of religious symbolism that goes on, maybe associated with different ceremonies and such. And we're kind of really pulling that in because of what we know about the Mesoamerican game, and we kind of make some leaps there that way. So both ceremonial gatherings or ball games would have increased the likelihood of diffusing tension and building alliances, but moreover, would have increased interdependence in the broadening culture of economic associations. And here's a picture of what contemporarily goes on. People hang out and watch a game. Think of going to a park, you see someone juggling, you get pulled in. Someone's doing tricks, you pay attention. So we kind of went through most of this, but I think what's interesting here is, again, this idea of posts. post holes having been excavated from the ball courts. Well, if it was always being played as a game, obviously the timber that was there, what was the purpose of that? Was that some goal of some kind? Did you have to do circles around it? We really don't know. It really makes a little bit more sense in some contexts. There were some aspects of ceremony involved with it, right? Not to say it was holding up a ramada, but that maybe he was doing something else, because all of our other understandings of the ball game don't have any thing in the way. It's just the oval plastered court. This is the best depiction I found that seems to represent it. So we have the playing alley itself, the embankment that's also plastered. We have this central marker. And here we have all these people watching. We have pit houses that are adjacent, and perhaps on the left or the right we have a plaza of some kind. 8 balls have been found. A couple of the classic rubber balls. The Chihuahua, where that plant grows, it is a ways away. So it might be that stone balls, sulfur balls, resins were used. There's a picture here of a rubber ball from the Hohokam area on the left, but I'm really more curious here on the right. Some of the Papagos people, the Pima people also played games where they had kicking balls, as they call them, that were wood. And that to me seems a little bit easier to deal with than a stone ball, right? And that also might explain a little bit of the reason why we haven't found so many. Kind of a ping pong paddle sort of implement that was found. 69 of them were found, complete and broken, down around Tucson at Tres Alamos Ball Court. So what was this about? And in particular, why were they also found at 3 other sites where only one of those 3 other sites had a ball court? Was it because they were playing their own sort of game, or was it really a ceremonial feature? So, the Mesoamerican game, in comparison, we know had been going on for thousands of years. This period, really important, 300 to 900. Ball courts were everywhere down in Mesoamerica. And then in the Hohokam period, later, it's still really an important place. And Tajin, which is here, imagine having 20 courts in a town, right? And unfortunately, I didn't do my editing correctly. This other town here, which is Chula here, 26 courts. In Azatlan, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is a Hohokam village, there were 4 in one town. One report was there were 6, but it really seems like that was more like 4. And that's way down in the lower Verde, right? But really close if you think about it to us. But all this really started way deep in Mexico. And these are 2 figurines. I'm sorry, that's one figurine and just 2 different aspects of it. They were found at Latango just last year. And a lot of figurines were found, right? What I thought was interesting about this figurine is it kind of has a belt-like something or another with a sash on it, right? Which might have something to do with how they play the game. This one here is also a whistle, by the way. So, a lot of political aspects to the Mesoamerican ball game, a lot of symbolism, bringing different communities together, human sacrifices associated as well. And when I say that, fortunately, we have a lot of these friezes and other artwork, pottery, figurines and the like, that really very specifically tell us how the Mesoamerican culture appreciated the ball court, what they did, who did the procession, and in what order, to what god, how many people, right? And also, strongly alluding to the fact of sacrifice associated with ball courts in some domains, but hard to interpret. Was it was it one of the losers? Was it one of the winners? Was it one that scored the most goals? It's really hard to know who may have been sacrificed. So here are some of these different other games that are depicted that help us understand. But as I said here, we have all these friezes. In Mesoamerica, they also have a lot of votive deposits ceremonially that are placed. And this idea of fertility being one of the main themes of the ball courts in Mesoamerica that we also find to be true in the Holocaust. Feasting as well being a big component. This is a picture that was in the 1965 National Geographic depicting the Hohokam ball game. It doesn't really seem to be depicting the Hohokam game, but the Mesoamerican game. All right? We have rings up here, right? That's just a function of the Mesoamerican game, not the Hohokam. Really steep walls here. Certainly this walls. What I really like about this portrayal is different players marked differently, so you can tell who's on your team. I don't know if this is a modern inclusion, maybe a referee of sorts, but it kind of looks like he's about to judge something. So this is why the former was more of a Mesoamerican court. We have, so we have rings, we have a bench here, very high walls to get to. Same true here. Playing alley, everything's squared off. This isn't made out of earth, it's made out of stone. We again have a playing alley, end zones, that bench that I mentioned, right? But in some cases, this apron can be vertical, and in other cases, it's more angled.
Was that Chichen Itza, or where was that?
We'll get there.
Okay, sorry.
And actually, no, we won't get to Chichen Itza as a picture, but you'll see the size of the site. So a lot of different shapes. So we have T shapes and I shapes, kind of like looking at the negative space sort of thing. So this court here, you can see that the apron's at an angle, right? And you don't have to do a whole lot to get maybe your ball through the ring. But everything's still squared off and such. And Ochagalo, this top one here is the picture that we just saw. And that one here is almost identical in size to the Reddington court, right? But as you can see here, the Chichen Itza court is larger than any of the Hohokam ones, as is the one at El Tajin. So some other pictorials of the game in Mesoamerica. And here, remember I mentioned that figurine having the padding around the waist and the sash, right? So hard to know, right? So maybe this is the hip game, right? Hip game, hard to know. They were wearing padded helmets, padding on the elbows, just padding on one elbow, padding on the knees. So this is Hohokam figurines taken from a burial cache that appear to have helmets on here and maybe padding on the arms. This one here might speak to what really the padding is. Oftentimes it was common to wear shell jewelry on the upper arm, so that might not be a one-to-one relationship there, but also a curious connection perhaps. So the whole common Mesoamerican ball courts, a lot of similarities, used for a lot of different things, festivities, cultural things, ball games, ceremonial deposits in both, and then some of the differences, right, being rectangular in Mesoamerica, stone and flat, not oval and earthen. These are some friezes and some artistic renditions that, again, help us understand what they were doing in the courts. I think it was like 52 or 56 where Mayan was deciphered, most of Mayan. So there's a number of different cultures that are involved that have ball courts, but we in particular have gotten a lot of information from the Mayan culture and the friezes and the artwork, and are able to really understand a lot better. And conversely, in the Hohokam, we have no real artistic accounts of a ball game in pottery, in figurines, in any such thing, unfortunately. So we have to use our archaeological skills of comparison and combining and relationships. I mentioned before this idea of a ceremonial system, including a lot of different components, right? But we can't get past the point of digging a hole like this. Looks a lot like the external female genitalia, right? And this whole idea of fertility and the earth and the underworld. All which are very common formative culture components of religious ceremony and fertility. So, in Hopi, we have the sipapu, a hole in the floor of the kiva, as a portal or passage to the underworld. And most of us were born through the vaginal canal into the world as a portal. So it's not the hardest comparison, certainly, to make. We have 200 plus, let's say. And it was set up so that they weren't even that far apart. 20 kilometers apart. Maybe to go from some of the ones out in the secondary periphery, right, from the core further out, maybe it was 2 days travel. But still something that could easily be done. This slide, I think, kind of hits on the 4 main reasons why the ballcourt network was successful. This widely accepted religious beliefs, the fact that there was a surplus agriculture production, that the environmental period was really conducive to not having flooding, not having droughts, not a royal cutting. The irrigation system of the Hohokam core was really stable. And because of that, there was a lot of dependencies that could develop, where all of a sudden one individual was really good at one task, another woman was really good at this task, and specialization could come into play. There was a lot of specialist producers in Hohokam that really made it unique as a culture during the pre-classic period. In a lot of respects, we should call it the classic period. So a lot of good supporting data for pottery as having specialist producers. Look at this house. There's pots all over the place, right? The water pots over here. But also less well-developed support for a lot of other artisan cultures. So this is a really interesting component of Abbott's research. In 2006, mostly was reported. So amazing to think that the cultures and the families in the core were only making 10% of their pottery. That's unheard of outside of there. In your family, you would make all your pots. You make your water pot, you make your cooking pots. Where here what was happening is that in Las Colinas, in South Mountain, and then in Queen Creek, and out here to the east in Snaketown, there were different groups of potters, kind of almost like they had their respective guilds, and they focused just on doing a certain pottery type with a certain specific temperament. Right? So for example, I like the South Mountain folks here, right? They had these 2 tempers that they used, and they were making all of the all of the big water carriers, right? It would make sense. You get good at something, you get more skilled, and that's what developed, especially during this period, right at the end, at the terminal phase of this religious revitalization network, or I should say ballcourt network. And the ball cart network actually allowed it to function, because you would have different societies that were 30 kilometers away, 60 kilometers away, that you could trade with. Unfortunately, it didn't all work out. Part of that had to do with some environmental things. Part of it had to do with different cultures being adjacent. The eastern peripheries started to have, there's some fighting that came on. All of a sudden there was a change to platform mounts. And the Holocaust, as you may know, did cremation burials. And now all of a sudden we see this introduction of inhumation burials. And all of that great interconnectedness and dependence and different communities learning about each other, learning skills from each other, about how to deal with irrigation, about how to deal with fixing your dwelling when it rained. All that started, that extra communication got lost. Here, by 1300, all the way through to 1300, all the pottery started to just be done in the family again. All that trade systems that we could nail down because of where the temper was made, right? We know all that went away. And what we ended up with was a new culture, a new religious understanding that had platform mounts in it. So it's all around 1070, right? So the abandonment of Snaketown, the abandonment of Catlin, Pueblo Grande, and Las Colinas, that I mentioned, was one of those 4 main pottery specialist villages. As soon as their ball cart was abandoned, their pottery uniqueness also went away. The Palo Verde, I shouldn't call it ruined ball cart, but let's call it that. They were up the Palo Verde River a little bit. Here we go, along the New River. And this was one of those communities that was really an aggregation. There was a lot of Pavian cultural people that were there. There was actually a number of different dwellings that were all noted as being their style of pit houses. And this was the connection going up north. And when this went down, all of a sudden, the obsidian changed. 50% of the obsidian was all coming from Government Mountain to the Salt River Basin. And that changed when the ball court network went down, and then all of a sudden the people in the lower Salt got most of their obsidian in the southwest from that. They got some from the southeast, but most of it moved to the southwest as their place of gathering. So this change that occurred, right? So this is Mesa Grande, Pueblo, and you can see, yes, it has a ball court, and this is the transition. This is where we're going. And this is Todd Bostwick saying, Holcomb religion changes from an underground-focused religion with a ball game played in subterranean courts to a sky-focused religion practiced from elevated courts. So a lot of different reasons why things changed, right? We have Chaco to the north. We have the mid-race culture to the east. Like I said, we have differences in how the river channels worked. We have the later eruption of Sunset Volcano, which must have changed some minds. And also this idea of cotton. All of a sudden, a new variant of cotton. Before 900, after 900, right during this period of 1000 to 1050, those are all the Coconino courts up here, right up on the ridge there in Sycamore Canyon. And here we have, after the Sunset Volcano, the Sacred Mountain and such, here. Right? And the reason for those guys being late is this is the best access going up to get to the Flagstaff courts, right? And it's understood that they were playing the game, they were doing trades, and in connection directly with the north. So this Verde Valley Court A, big. Perkins Court, big. The Perkins Court is there. This is where the Verde Valley Court is, right? 2 days away, right? To go from this court to the court down here, which is the closest, which I really think was here at this time period, is another 2 days. So they can communicate, right? It's a communication link. You have to do it overnight on the way, but we can make it to Sarah's house. This round mountain court was the last constructed of the Coconino courts. And that's a bit of an intriguing piece because this court here, 123, was playing with 121, which was the Perkins Court, right at the end, right before the Perkins Court shut down. Right? But the Coconino courts, we really don't have any holocaunt anything. We have no holocaunt pit houses. We have no jewelry. No anything. All right. So this is just 11 years ago, I guess now. Let's see, excuse me. Joe Vogel found this from the air. Now this is one of the ones that's out towards the Prescott area, right? Probably 1100s from Dr. Wilcox. No sherds there, and there's the thought that maybe there's a small court that's up here as well. So things are still being found, still being appreciated. This is a bit of a big slide, and what I'm going to say is it's a bit important to realize that early in the Hohokam pre-classic period, that there was a lot of Hohokam influence in the valley, in the river valleys, on the western side of the valley. On the west side of the valley, there was a lot of Kayenta influence up along the rim, right? So there was this separated buffer zone between the two, right? That changed as we got later and later into the pre-classic period where it became more and more Kayenta based, and then all of a sudden we have the Sacred Mountain Ball Court and such becomes a bridge to the multi-ethnic courts that are also going up north. But the Hohokam presence here is not the result of migration, right? It isn't like, 50 families from Hohokam came up here and decided to, join the beauty that exists here. It was really more trade and people that were facilitating the trade. This is the site card from the Verde Ball Court, right? Very good farming in the area, called Verde Hohokam, designated as having 2 ball courts, right? So when we think of where Clear Creek Ruin is, if we go basically across the Verde River, over into the plain there, that is where the Verde Ball Court site is. It's the only site in the Verde Valley that has 2 courts. I put this in, it looks really big looking at it here. I was making a comment about the nearest court, right, being 2 miles north or south. I thought it was just kind of interesting that there was this one pit house style dwelling there at this site. And look at how much pottery they found that was Hohokam, right? When it was reinvestigated, it seems like maybe only 5%, but this is still a significant amount. And then we have different shell bracelets and other things involved. Remember when I said the Coconina, those 5 ball courts, and actually the whole Coconina culture, according to Dr. Wilcox, no shell jewelry at all. Nothing. Right? So there was real separation there between that community, it seems. Fair enough. So here we are up on above Sycamore Canyon, Wagner Hill and the like, right? So all very close to each other, right? And remember, we're talking about 1,000 to 1,050, right? A small period right before this was abandoned and the Coconino culture went up to Sick Mountain, up on the side, backside of Humphreys, and then around Humphreys into Deadman's Wash, moving up, or I should say down, towards Wapaki. Here's the Wagner Court, Dr. Wilcox again, this idea of no holocaunt artifacts. Yeah, all the other Coconina courts, all were rock burned. Remember what I said about erosion changing things? Well, this one's a little different. And in a while we'll see a picture of the cows walking in the water. This tells us a little bit about distances. So I was just mentioning Wagner Hill, right? So 15 kilometers to Perkinsville, right? It's a half day. It's not even a full day's travel, right? But 2 days travel to get over to these pre-eruption ball courts. So these are all pre-eruption ball courts, and the remainder are after the eruption. And again, like 2 days to get from the Flagstaff courts down to the Verde Valley. We have, now being up in Flagstaff with our 13 courts, we have the Frontier courts and the Heartland courts. And here we have these 4 that were all in operation pre-eruption. Here's kind of the fallout zone from the eruption, right? Smack in between and kind of over a couple of these sites. On the pre-eruption side, we have new caves and old caves being utilized at that period. But here I just thought it was interesting, what's the size of these 2 courts? What's their orientation? They're both pointing, off to the north, but the northeast. Here are the 2 courts at Ridge Ruin, but they're like twice as big, but they're all pointing off, to the northwest. Here's Winona Village, and here's C. This is our Holocon pit house. We have some dates here that, we kind of know things are a little bit later because we have a good cutting date. We have a ball court that's a little bit in between the new caves and the Ridge Ruin courts. And here we have the ceramic dating that I said, hey, not always the best date to put emblazoned in your mind, but helpful, especially when we look at other information about other dates. Some Holocaunt jewelry from the Winona Village, other shell jewelry found in other villages with ball courts, certainly at Wapaki as well. And here, I wanted to just quickly describe this idea of the multicultural aspect of Flagstaff and the movement of the Coconina that I just mentioned. So the Coconina, the San Francisco mountain grayware, that's the green. That's the green here, moving from pre-eruption to post-eruption. And then we have the Alameda brownware in, let's call it orange. And then the Tucson grayware in blue, right? And this be representing 3 different cultures all living in very close proximity and how things change through time is what we're going to look at here. So pre-eruption, and then right after the eruption, and then all of a sudden we have all this Coconina movement into the frontier area, moving down towards Wapaki. All right? We certainly have the Tucson folks here still rather concentrated, but here we really can see how the Alameda where is still really strong in the Sinagua group. This is really where I wanted us to get to. All right, so this is the frontier area where we have Wapaki with its ball court and its unroofed kiva. And a number of different sites have unroofed kivas, right? As well as having ball courts, right? And we see how we have this depiction still of the the Coconina being here, and the Sinagua being strongly represented in Wapaki. how this distills down to me is the idea of the ball courts versus the kivas, and how they perhaps were used as a way for the different cultural conflicts that came into play. Everything wasn't always roses. There's a lot of different violence that was reported during this period post-eruption between different groups. And here we have a diversity index. So the most diverse groups all had ball courts. That isn't a one-to-one relationship to say that means that the ball courts help them stay more diverse cultures with different ideas and perhaps conflicting understandings of logic streams. But I thought that was an interesting component here. This is just a big picture here talking about different environmental conditions, pre-eruption, post-eruption, the great houses of good old Ridge-Gruen and Wapaki that had different Chacoan components early on, different veneers and stuff, but then they were then burned out, ceremonially closed, and really the Sinagua influence then was really seen striking. But hey, these ball courts, these post-eruption ball courts, right, are used right to 12, up to 1275. Maybe some of them closed down at 1250, maybe some of them 1225, right? But by 1275, all this had been abandoned. All this had been, everything had really changed to the point that Chavez Pass and a couple other pueblos were up on Anderson Mesa, and that's where the northern Sinagua resided. There was speculation at one point, was there a ball court up on Chavez Pass, but that hasn't been substantiated in any significant way. So, we need more excavation. The only significant information we have about ball courts is about surveying. And when I say significant, I'm saying we don't have an appropriate sample size to get us to have a 95% confidence interval. We only have that with surveying. But like I said, we have all sorts of different problems with surveying. So we're doing the best we can. We have a lot of associated information that's very helpful. But we only have a handful of excavations. So if we're going to talk about these post holes and where they are, or if we're going to talk about the different markers with the votives underneath them centrally or towards the ends, it's really hard if we don't have more information or more even testing that had been done in specific areas to be able to say, oh yes, this is a very consistent, culturally translatable idea that went all the way through Holocaunt, perhaps all the way from the core, all the way up to the tertiary, right? We don't have any appreciation of that. Last but not least, we have the Casas Grandes style, right? So 2 in New Mexico, 13 in Chihuahua, and 4 in Sonora. There's no ball courts known in California. But these Casas Grandes style, linear, rectangular, a lot more Mesoamerican, but they're not using stone to create them. They're using adobe construction in some where they can in Pacame. But mostly, it's the dirt berm construction, more Holocaunt-like. Different styles of sorts, so we have I's and T styles, but this is what's seen a lot, right? All we have left is almost this racetrack looking thing, right? Where this was the court, it was just bounded on one side or another by this rock berm that had been eroded through time that we're assuming had dirt on it. So Pacame, here's this court here, right? I'm calling it a modified I shape because if I say an I shape, then I could very easily think of the Mesoamerican court where everything was angular. Everything was set up in that domain. But interesting. And here you can see the Pacame had 3 courts right there. And another 8 right around it within 75 kilometers within 2 days, let's say. 2 long days. A lot of them are I-shaped, some are T-shaped, and a lot are just kind of this rock berm. A couple up in New Mexico as well. So this was for real. So we're talking about 1200 to 1450, after the Hohokam. In many respects. Certainly after the Hohokam, we're using ball courts during the pre-classic period, because that really ended at 1100. This is another site. So here we have Pakme here, site 204. So this test site was just done last October, right? Another I-shaped court. In this town here, they have some ovens, but also some mounds. So what this can tell us is that Pakme wasn't the only pueblo that had leadership, right? The fact that we have mounds here and a ball court shows that there's other leadership in other domains as well. So we have all sorts of damage that is going on in ball courts. I mentioned the cows before, farming, tilling under a ball court so we don't even ever know they're there, they're just lost. And I kind of mentioned that idea of erosion that we kind of can see here in this enhanced image, satellite image, where we can see the different erosive cutting from water, different human intervention here, perhaps people going in looking for something. These two boxes here represent these boxes, where this top one is this one here, where we actually can see the erosion that comes into play. And this one here shows that, someone wanted to come in and take a ponderosa pine out because it was dead and they wanted the firewood, let's say. Right? Here we have the Wagner Hill, right? And water collects, like we saw long before, with different trees growing in one of the sites, and how things get disturbed here, rocks get pulled up. I mentioned the idea that it's hard sometimes for us to know where the primary berm was. Well, some of this satellite imaging can really help us to really differentiate really small magnitudes and different soil types, so that we can better say, well, where was the berm, so we actually can measure things and do our surveying better. So we're at Ridge Ruin here. So I haven't been here in 2-3 years, but I don't remember any sort of truck road, any sort of road that's 6 meters away from either of those ball courts. So my thought is that this is quite, and these images are all from a report that came out in 2020. And here we have a cattle track here as well. This idea of us doing more is always helpful. Unfortunately, archaeology, sometimes it's difficult to do it for all sorts of cultural and other significant reasons. But more surveying, really helpful. Perhaps some more testing, specific testing would be helpful. And there might be times where some excavation would be particularly helpful, especially if we have to have more expansion of roads and stuff. I think it's really important to let the different private owners know about that. The Perkinsville court was actually, when it was dug up, the family was kind enough to call in some archaeologists to look at it before they plowed it under. So some surveying, some different dating techniques, really helpful. And we've gone through a lot, right? The big picture is that ball courts really helpful, but not all about the ball game. A lot more about the ceremony and how the ball game was just a component of it. But if we have ceremony, we have people come in. If we have people come in, maybe they also watch a ball game. But if people come in, they're also bringing their pots, perhaps. They're different wares, they're different clothes, they're all sorts of different baskets. And things get shared with different ideas, and there's a certain expansion and heightening of understanding and appreciation of how to communicate between cultures, as well as within it. Yeah, so thanks.
And I'd like to thank John Petrescu and Spence Gustav for filming this. And I think, Steph, if you want to take questions.
Sure, of course. Just beforehand, I just wanted to really acknowledge acknowledge some people who were really helpful in communicating with me. Dr. Wilcox, I probably talked to him twice a week for 2 months. Right? And a lot of these people were really helpful. The Verde Valley Archaeology Center's library is really fantastic. And I'm really grateful to the people that were so helpful. The one extra thing other than some of those primary sources, down here at the bottom, I really thought this was intriguing. This is again something just from a year ago. It's comparing the different ritual assemblages of Pueblo Bonito, Aztec, Wapaki, and Ridge Ruin. And I thought it was just a really interesting, it was a dissertation, and it was really helpful to me if people wanted to look at that. That was a curiosity. But yeah, questions, please. Yes, thank you.
I never heard you mention any connection to climate factors that may have influenced the rise and fall of the ballcourts. Do you have any studies into that?
I think there was one point that I did mention it, so I'm sorry I perhaps didn't emphasize it a lot. I think I made the comment that during this ball court society period, when the ball courts were so big, that there weren't a lot of droughts. There wasn't a lot of flooding in Arroyo County. It was really quite a stable period. And right at that transition at 1050, all of a sudden we start to have those sorts of problems that actually put a lot of pressure on the pottery specialists. The pottery specialists, interestingly enough, tended to put themselves at the end of the canals. And perhaps part of that was just being logical. They're at the end of the canal, so they had everyone upstream getting the water before them. Right? So maybe they always didn't get the best. But if they made good pots, they could always trade for food. Right? So that was a component that linked in, and then some archaeologists comment that when the ball court system fell apart, that because of the droughts and then the respective flooding, that arroyo undercutting, undermining the irrigation system, really meant that these people at the ends of the line, these different artisans, potters, all of a sudden were really strapped, right? It created more need for really strong leadership and a change in the whole common structure. But even with the good leadership, they weren't able to hold it together for not a couple hundred years. Great question. Please, sir.
Do you know what the basis of the dates of the excavation and issues of the ball courts are?
Can you ask that again? I didn't understand what you meant about the excavation component.
Well, you gave some excavation dates for a ball court. Is that based on pottery found, or how are they estimating those dates?
Yeah, so in a few different ways. Certainly by using the ceramics, preferably ceramics at the base, down at the floor. But even that can get really confusing. For example, at Wapaki, there were only 2 pieces of pottery found in the ball court, both Flagstaff black and white. And but if for any of us that had the chance to be there, right in front of the ball court, there's a bit of a natural drainage. And one of the ideas is that perhaps those 2 just flowed in at some time, right? Ceramics are always a little bit hard with ball courts, because where are we taking the ceramics from? You know, we tend to stratify things and take things from different layers, so we begin to appreciate depth corresponding to dating. But when we're also doing excavations, we're looking at the actual berms themselves, and is the pottery that was taken out of the ball court when it was dug placed on the berm, right? And then more was placed. So you kind of don't know what's on the berm, but what's the date on the berm in comparison. And I guess I'll finish on that idea by just bringing up Dr. Wilcox commenting to me so strongly one day about how we couldn't go with a main ceramic date, right? So even Winona Village, that's also been excavated, that had a mean ceramic date, but you remember that mean ceramic date's like 20 years earlier than the last cutting date for like roof beams, right? And Dr. Wilcox emphasizing that we need to look at the whole group of the ceramic assemblage and look at that in connection with other things like cutting dates, where the respective pit houses were, and other components dictate things. So there's confusion that comes into play. But we have a really good understanding that, what would that be? I guess 9 of those courts in Flagstaff were all post-eruption. And based on the latest good science on the eruption was in 1085 to 1090. It wasn't back in 1064, which was a well held on understanding until the research done that came out around 2010.
Any other questions?
Yeah. No, she's going to bring you the mic, sir.
Who wants to move them? Thank you. Any lower? Are you waiting? All right.
I have to talk while you were speaking, and several of that you touched on just now. And several thoughts came to me that when there are any depressions, depending on the weather cycle, what the weather really was like, they could have used the wet season to allow silt to come into the ball area, work that silt into the surface, very smooth and soft, and then let it break out and have the days during the warm part of the year when they have a really beautiful ball surface. Well, the weather's changed, but I remember the great interest one time when it was about 1332, were 2 gigantic floods not happening here too. It was just devastating. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people. Terrible drought and terrible floods and things have changed. Mostly the many ice age back then and the later than the ice age. Which is what undoubtedly is out here too, I believe.
I think it's really important to think about when there were droughts. It's also a little complicated too, because the big drought, you mentioned like 1275-ish, that happened in the Kayenta lands in Mesa Verde, that drought that was so significant there was not significant in Verde Valley. And I'm taking that from Carlo Van West's information and such. So we kind of have to know where the drought was and where it was significant and where it wasn't, and things are different all over the world. But certainly there was a difficult time all over the world when things vacillated for a few hundred years there, both good times and more troubling afterwards. Yes, please.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. That was really considering you've only been studying for 2 years, it's quite remarkable that you acquired this much knowledge. With regard to the posts that you were talking about, has there been any consideration, and maybe I missed it in what you were talking about, but were the ball courts potentially used as marketplaces, and could it have been for like platforms for entertainment or selling of items or something like that? Or I don't know what the dispersal was of the posts, but
I would have to reflect a little bit and say it could be all of the above. I had to ponder for a second, well, would it be considered, pardon the comment, but sacrilegious to have a marketplace going on inside the court, considering the votives and all of the ceremonial structure of it? Would it have been that the main marketplace would have been outside of it, where they could have put up a lot of temporary remodeling and such? But all this really is just really hard to know, especially if we don't have more excavation or tests, so we can really say, oh, there is an order to this. Why? But we relationally can't say right now. Yes, please.
Steph, is there any oral tradition being handed down by the present tribes on ball courts at all?
No, not at all. Yeah, and I probably shouldn't be so definitive about that. But everything that I understand from everyone I've spoken to is that there's no ethnographic information that helps shed light on what was going on in the Hohokam ball courts. What else? Yeah.
Sure.
Steph, I was interested in the one at Wapaki. That's not very well built for a ball game because it goes downhill. So there must have been some other kind of ceremony there.
Really good point, and maybe that dovetails into what I was saying a minute ago. And this is really just straight up conjecture. But I mentioned the two Flagstaff black on white ceramics that were found basically at the level of the floor, and the fact that perhaps they were just carried in by water because of that little slight drainage that's right in front of it. So my guess here, and it is a complete guess, is that the reason for the aspect of the floor at Wapaki has a bit to do with they didn't have a lot of space perhaps to put it, so it could be proximal. Because if you go just north of where they put it, then there's the primary drainage that goes down and shuttles it all the way down to Little Colorado. So it might have been, they might have said, well, maybe this isn't the best place, but let's put it here. And let's have a little slope to it so that it can drain itself out. There's certainly a lot of talk as to why the Wapaki ball court itself, why is it not earthen like every other ball court, right? Why did they put stone in this one, right? I have no absolute understanding about it. The Hopi apparently have commented that it wasn't used as a ball court at all in a Hohokam understood style. It was maybe used as a kicking game for children, right? So that's just one thing that I come across. But remember that for these ball courts, we're always using this plastering, right, to help it so that the dirt doesn't come down onto the playing alley, right? So there's a certain aspect of it being kept tidy. I don't know if that's just being practical or if it's ceremonial. But Dr. Wilcox commented to me that the reason why stone was used there was because of the pumice. And because of that volcanic ash and such, that they needed something that was more stout to hold it back, which didn't completely make complete sense to me, but perhaps the porous nature and how water would percolate through it, perhaps that was part of the idea, is that if you put the walls up, put a berm on the outside, that then you can seal it with plaster going up the walls, because it was plaster, and then would have more fortitude over the course of years. And you might recall, I didn't mention it, but the plastering of the floors and the embankments a lot of times had different layers to them, where you can see, just like walls and murals, where there's different layers, so you can see the generations of time a certain oval court was used. What else?
One more question, anybody?
I have one more. The shells,
The shells that were found, are they from the Gulf or are they from the Pacific, or do they know?
So at Wapaki, there's shells from the Pacific, from California, that were traded across. There's also Wapaki shells that are coming from the Gulf of California. But outside of Wapaki, it's all coming from the Gulf of California to the respective villages. And all through the Trincheras area, or from the long loop coming from Llanos, both from the Sea of Cortez.
Okay, is that everybody? Any more questions? No? Well, let's give Steph another round of applause. It's been our honor. This is our first in-person presentation in over a year. So, I don't know what we're doing next month. I haven't decided. But I know that hopefully starting in September, we will start being able to have some people come.